The afternoon light fell in long golden strips across the garden at Varenhollow Park, and Emmerich Dawnford, Duke of Caldenmere, was doing what he did best at social gatherings, standing slightly apart from everyone else and wishing he were somewhere else entirely. He had come because Casimir Vielle had asked him personally, and Casimir was the kind of man whose requests carried the full weight of obligation. They had been at university together, had served briefly in the same regiment before Emmerich's father died, and the dukedom demanded his return, had stood as witnesses at each other's most significant moments. When Casimir asked, Emmerich came. It was as simple and as complicated as that. What Casimir had neglected to mention when extending the invitation was that his sister would be attending. Senara Aldwyn stood beneath the old willow at the far end of the garden, dressed in a gown of pale gray that did nothing to diminish the quiet beauty she had always possessed, and everything to remind anyone watching that she was still in half mourning for a husband dead 2 years. She was speaking to someone Emmerich did not recognize, nodding at appropriate intervals, her expression pleasant and hollow. He had been watching her on and off for the better part of an hour. He could not seem to help it. He had been watching her on and off for considerably longer than an hour, if he was being truthful with himself, which he generally tried not to be. She had not looked at him once. 2 years since Edmund Aldwyn's death. 2 years since Emmerich had stood in the rain outside a church in Cambridgeshire and understood, with the sharp clarity that grief can bring, exactly what he had lost. Not Edmund alone, though God knew the loss of Edmund had gutted him in ways he still did not have words for, but something else. Some possibility he had spent years convincing himself did not exist, and then had been forced to watch lowered into cold ground alongside his closest friend. He was good at turning away. He looked away now. He was considerably less skilled at what happened next. Something small and determined collided with his leg. Emmerich looked down. A boy, perhaps 5 years old, with dark, serious eyes and disheveled dark hair and a smear of something that was almost certainly cake along his left cheek, looked up at him with the absolute composure of a child who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere. Pyron Aldwyn, Edmund's son. Emmerich had seen him only twice since the funeral, both times at a careful distance, both times arranged to ensure that Senara did not have to encounter him directly. The boy tilted his head. "You're the Duke," he announced. "I am," Emmerich agreed carefully. "Casimir says you're the most important man in the county." Piron considered this with visible skepticism. "You don't look very important." That is generally considered a diplomatic failing. Piron appeared to weigh this assessment. Then, with complete deliberateness, he sat down on Emmerich's left boot. Emmerich stared at him. No one had ever sat on his boot before. He was reasonably certain this had not been covered by any code of conduct he had ever been taught. "You could find somewhere more comfortable," he offered. "I like it here." Pyron looked back up at him, dark eyes extraordinarily direct for a child his age. "Do you know my mama?" Something tightened in Emmerich's chest. "I knew your father." "Papa's gone." The boy said it without drama, the way children sometimes named enormous things that adults could not bear to say plainly. "Mama says he's in heaven. Casimir says he's watching over us." He paused, thinking this over with genuine philosophical interest. "I think if Papa was watching, he'd want Mama to be happy." Emmerich said nothing. He did not trust himself to say anything. "She isn't, though." Piron pulled at a loose thread on his jacket with perfect absorption. "Happy, I mean. She smiles when she thinks I need her to, but that isn't the same thing, is it?" It was not quite a question. He looked up again, those dark eyes unwavering. "My mama never smiles. Not really. Not like she means it." The words landed somewhere between Emmerich's ribs and stayed there. He looked up without meaning to. Across the garden, Sonara had turned slightly, her profile caught in the slanting afternoon light, and he saw it then with a clarity that hit like cold water. The careful stillness behind her eyes. The precise maintenance of a woman who had learned to perform, living without actually inhabiting it. She was present in every technical sense, and absent in every way that mattered, moving through the afternoon like a portrait of herself, beautiful and remote and wholly unreachable. She had always been the most alive person in any room she entered. That brightness, that quality of hers that made everything around her feel more real, had been the first thing he had noticed about her, and the last thing he had ever expected to watch extinguished. Grief had not dimmed it so much as buried it, and looking at her now, he felt the absence of it as a specific and physical ache. My mama never smiles. 5 words from a child of 5, and something that Emmerich Donford had kept locked and silent and very carefully buried, shifted in his chest with a finality that frightened him. Piran. Sonara's voice, low and controlled, came from directly behind him. Emmerich straightened. She was crossing the grass toward them with her characteristic economy of movement, and the composure about her was so complete, it looked like armor, because it was. Come away, please. You know better than to trouble people. He wasn't troubling me, Emmerich said. She stopped a few feet away, and for the first time all afternoon, her eyes met his. Gray eyes, the precise shade of winter sky before snow, and full of something carefully governed that he could not name. Your Grace. The address was faultlessly correct and without warmth. Mrs. Aldwin. A silence stretched between them. Thin. Dangerous. The particular silence of 2 people who had said very little to each other and meant a great deal by it. Piran, come here, please. She extended her hand without looking away from Emmerich, and something in her face communicated with complete clarity that whatever her son had been saying, she wished he had not. That she understood instinctively what a 5-year-old was capable of naming to the wrong person at precisely the wrong moment. Piran climbed to his feet with cheerful reluctance. I like him, Mama, he offered, helpfully. I'm very glad to hear it, she said evenly. Come. Mrs. Aldwin. Emmerich heard himself speak before he had made the decision to. She paused, hand still extended toward Piran. You look well. It was a lie, and they both understood it as one. She did not look well. She looked like a woman who had forgotten what well felt like and stopped expecting to remember. Thank you, she said. 2 words of such perfect neutrality that they constituted a small masterpiece of controlled withdrawal. Then she took Piran's hand and turned and walked back across the garden without looking back. Emmerich stood there, boots still warm from where a small boy had sat on it, watching the gray of her gown disappear among the other guests. Piran glanced back once over his shoulder, lifted a hand in an unself-conscious wave, and then turned forward again, chattering something up at his mother that Emmerich could not hear. My mama never smiles. Not really. Not like she means it. He looked down at his boot, then back across the garden. Then he made a decision so quiet it barely registered as a decision at all. But it was the kind of quiet decision that changes everything, the kind made not with proclamation, but with the simple and absolute certainty that something which is wrong needs to be made right. He would change that. He did not know how yet. He did not know what it would cost. But the boy had said it plainly, and Emmerich had heard it plainly. And some things, once heard, cannot be unheard. The fire started 3 days later. No one could say with certainty how it began. The cottage Sonara had been renting since the settlement of Edmund's estate was a solid, unpretentious place, low ceilings and wide stone hearths and a garden that Piran had annexed almost immediately as his own sovereign territory. It was modest by the standards of her upbringing, but it was hers, which was something she had valued more than she had expected. Rooms that held only what she had chosen to put in them. Space that carried no one else's history. By the time the coachman sounded the alarm, the eastern wing was already beyond saving. No one was hurt. She held on to that through the gray early morning, standing in the road with Piran pressed close against her side, and Mrs. Fenwick, her housekeeper, weeping quietly into a borrowed apron. No one was hurt. Everything else was material. Everything else could be managed, except that it could not, quite, be managed. Not immediately. Casimir was in London. His letter, arriving by express that afternoon, was warm and entirely useless on the urgent question of where she was to sleep that night. His townhouse in the city was shut up for the season. Varenhollow was hosting his wife's family until the end of the month. The nearest inn was 8 miles distant, with a damp problem and questionable linen. Sanara sat in the road in front of what remained of the eastern wall and tried to locate her self-possession. "Mama." Piran tugged her sleeve. "Where are we sleeping tonight?" "I'm thinking." "Mrs. Fenwick says we should go to Caldenmere Hall." He said it with the brightness of a child who had been waiting to suggest this since approximately the moment the fire was discovered. "She says the Duke would want to help. She says he was Papa's closest friend." "Mrs. Fenwick says a great deal," Sanara said. "He listened to me at the party," Piran offered. "Most grown-ups don't really listen. They just wait for you to stop talking." He actually listened. She looked at her son, at the genuine animation in his face, the first uncomplicated brightness she had seen all day after a morning of smoke and alarm and adult fear that children were never supposed to witness. She could not explain to Piran why Caldenmere Hall was not a straightforward option. Could not explain the complicated architecture of guilt and grief and something else she refused to examine that existed between herself and Emmerich Donford. Could not explain that the last time she had been inside Caldenmere Hall was 3 weeks before Edmund died, when they had all dined together, and she had caught herself watching the Duke across the table with a feeling she had immediately and thoroughly buried. Edmund was gone. The feeling, infuriatingly, had not followed him. "We are not going to Caldenmere Hall," she said. They arrived at Caldenmere Hall by nightfall. She had run out of alternatives. Casimir's land steward, reached by hasty letter, had responded within hours with the same suggestion Mrs. Fenwick had made. And Emmerich himself had sent a note, brief and formal, stating only that rooms had been made ready and that his staff would see to everything required. The efficiency of it was somehow more unsettling than warmth would have been. It left her nothing to argue against. Caldenmere Hall rose from the evening mist like something that had always simply been there, long and gray and vast, set back behind an avenue of oaks some ancestral Donford had planted, with the quiet confidence of a man who assumed his line would last. Light glowed in the windows. A footman appeared at the carriage door before they had stopped. A second emerged to take charge of the single trunk they had managed to save. Emmerich was waiting in the entrance hall. He looked exactly as he always looked, controlled and precise, the kind of man who occupied formal spaces as though they had been built around him. He was taller than she had allowed herself to remember. His dark hair was beginning to silver at the temples, and he wore it with the ease of a man who had never once questioned his place in the world. She had always found that quietly maddening. "Mrs. Aldwyn," he stepped forward. "I am glad you came." "You left me very limited options," she said pleasantly. Something shifted in his face, almost too slight to catch. "I'm aware of that." He looked down at Piran with a gravity that would have been faintly absurd, directed at a 5-year-old, except that, somehow, it was not. Welcome to Caldenmere Hall, Piran. Piran surveyed the entrance hall with enormous eyes. The ceiling was painted. There was a chandelier. There was a staircase wide enough for 6 people abreast. It's very big, he said solemnly. I have always found it excessive, Emmerich agreed. You are welcome to explore it tomorrow, if your mother permits. Can I, Mama? She looked at her son's face, at the brightness in it, the first uncomplicated brightness she had seen since morning. Yes, she said, if you behave yourself thoroughly. Piran beamed. For one unguarded moment he looked startlingly like Edmund, and she looked away before the feeling could settle. Thank you for your hospitality, she said, addressing a point just past Emmerich's shoulder. It will not be for long, a week at most, until Casimir returns and can make proper arrangements. There is no particular hurry, Emmerich said. There is, rather, she said quietly, and left it there. She could feel him watching her, and had the uncomfortable certainty that he understood the shape of what she was not saying. He was too perceptive by half, always had been, and she had given 2 years to being grateful for the distance between them that made his perceptiveness irrelevant. The housekeeper will take you up, he said, and stepped back. Exactly as he should be. She followed the housekeeper upstairs with Piran's hand in hers, and told herself that 1 week was nothing. 1 week was survivable enough. She had survived considerably worse. She almost believed it. The first 2 days settled into a careful and negotiated peace that neither of them fully trusted. Emmerich was a thoughtful host, in the manner that very private men sometimes managed, attentive without being intrusive, ensuring that everything needed appeared before it had to be requested, that Piran was kept occupied and delighted by a young groom who had been assigned the sole task of showing one small boy every horse in the Caldenmere stables. He joined them for dinner both evenings, said the appropriate things, asked the appropriate questions, and never once pressed past the surface of conversation that Sonara maintained with the precision of a woman who had learned that surfaces were the only reliably safe ground. She was beginning to breathe slightly easier when the Renwicks arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. She heard the carriage from the window of the sitting room she had claimed as her own, looked out, and felt something drop in her stomach in a way she had not anticipated. Calloway Renwick descended first, elegant and unhurried. He was Edmund's age, would have been Edmund's age, and had moved in the same circle of men who had filled those years with country house parties and long weekends in the field. He had always been pleasant to her. Attentive, she now recognized, in a way she had not fully registered at the time, hovering at a respectful distance that made more sense to her now than it had then. He had spent the 2 years since Edmund's death calling on Casimir with a frequency that stretched friendship into something more purposeful. Behind him came his mother, Lady Renwick, formidably upright, her eyes already conducting a thorough inventory of the Caldenmere entrance hall with the efficiency of a woman who made it her business to assess exactly this kind of situation. Sonara stepped back from the window. She had not been told they were expected. It had not occurred to her to ask whether other guests would be in the house during this week. This carefully temporary week she had promised herself would conclude before anything complicated could develop. She had been so focused on managing the arrangement from the inside that the outside had not fully registered until this moment. She went downstairs because remaining in the sitting room would have been worse. Emmerich was in the entrance hall when she arrived. He turned when he heard her on the stairs, and something crossed his face too quickly to read. Then Calloway shifted as well, and his reaction required considerably less effort to interpret. Sonara. He used her given name with the ease of long familiarity, and something that reached just past it. What a remarkable surprise. I had no idea you were staying here. Nor I that you were expected, she said, keeping her voice light and pleasant. A long-standing arrangement, Lady Renwick said, her gaze moving between Sonara and Emmerich with the attentiveness of a woman conducting a careful assessment. though I confess, I had not understood that Caldenmere was entertaining other guests at present. The pause before other guests was small enough to deny and pointed enough to register. Sonara felt the shift in the room before she fully understood it, felt the way everything recalibrated around her presence, around the particular vulnerability of her position, a widow alone, without a chaperone, residing in a bachelor duke's household, with only her young son and an aging housekeeper who had stayed on out of loyalty. She watched Lady Renwick's assessment proceed with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had spent decades knowing precisely what such arrangements indicated. "Mrs. Aldwyn is here at my invitation," Emmerich said, his voice steady and level. "Following a fire at her cottage 3 days ago. She is a guest under my protection." He paused for exactly 1 beat. "As my intended." The words fell into the room like something dropped from a height. Sonara turned to look at him. He did not look at her. His face was pleasant and directed at Lady Renwick with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to making declarations that were not questioned. She had not been consulted, had not been warned, had been given no time whatsoever to prepare for what she was currently being required to perform, which was the calm confirmation of a lie she had been handed, without warning, in front of 2 witnesses. Calloway had gone very still. "I was not aware," he said carefully, "that you were engaged, Dawnford." "Very recently," Emmerich said smoothly. "We had not yet made any formal announcement. Given the circumstances of Mrs. Aldwyn's arrival here, it seemed the most natural explanation." He met her gaze then, finally, and in the space of a single steady look, communicated both an apology and a question, asking without words whether she would hold the line with him or let it fall apart around them both. She thought about Lady Renwick's measuring eyes, about Calloway's sudden stillness, about Pyrrhon upstairs with the groom and the horses, who understood none of this and would understand nothing. Later, of why a whispered ruin could close every door in every room of a life. "It has been rather sudden," Sonara said pleasantly. "We are both still somewhat astonished by it." Something beneath Emmerich's face, barely perceptibly, released. "How charming," Lady Renwick said, in a tone suggesting she found it nothing of the sort. "Congratulations to you both." Her gaze settled on Sonara, with the weight of a woman filing something away for later. "You must tell us everything at dinner." Sonara smiled. It did not reach her eyes. But it was a smile, the first one she had produced all morning, that had not required deliberate assembly. Emmerich appeared at her side, as the Renwicks were escorted upstairs, close enough to speak without being heard. "I owe you an explanation," he said quietly. "You owe me considerably more than that." "Yes." A pause. "I am sorry. There was no time to warn you." "There was time for a single word," she said, keeping her face pleasant and her eyes directed forward. "1 word would have sufficed. You are right." She glanced at him. He looked for just a moment, genuinely discomfited, and she found she could not decide whether that made things better or worse. It was easier to manage him when he was controlled. Discomfort made him look almost approachable, and approachable was a complication she did not need. "1 question," she said. "Of course. How long do you intend this fiction to last?" He was quiet for a beat longer than was comfortable. "Until the Renwicks leave. 5 days at most." 5 days presenting herself as the intended of Emmerich Dawnford, Duke of Caldenmere, in the same house as a man who had spent 2 patient years watching her become available, and a woman who had spent those same 2 years sharpening her ability to detect exactly this kind of lie. 5 days, she repeated. "I will explain everything to Casimir when he returns. You will explain it to me first, this evening, after Pyrrhon is in bed." She did not wait for his answer. She moved toward the staircase with her chin level and her face steady, and the clear private knowledge that she was in considerably more difficulty than a fire at a rented cottage had any right to produce. Behind her, she heard Emmerich exhale slowly. It sounded precisely like a man who had committed his full weight to ice and was only now registering how thin it was. The evening that Emmerich had promised would end in an honest conversation did not go as either of them had planned. Lady Renwick kept dinner moving until nearly 10, steering the table with the practiced efficiency of a woman who understood that information was best extracted in company, when people were too social and too tired to maintain their full defenses. She asked about the courtship in the oblique and pleasant manner of someone who did not require direct answers because she was reading the spaces between them. She asked about Piran with a warmth that felt like a probe. She asked when a formal announcement might be expected from Caldenmere Hall, at which Emmerich said something smooth and non-committal that Lady Renwick received with a smile, suggesting she found it insufficient. By the time the company dispersed, Piran had long since been carried up to bed, and Sonara was too exhausted to sustain anything resembling honesty. She told Emmerich the conversation could wait until morning, and she could see from the way he looked at her that he understood it was not a postponement, but a strategic withdrawal. He let her go without argument. It was Calloway who found her the following morning. She had gone to the library before anyone else was awake, a habit carried from the cottage where mornings had been entirely her own. She had taken a book from the shelf without looking at its title and had been sitting in the window seat for nearly 20 minutes when she realized she had not turned a single page. "You are an early riser." Calloway appeared in the doorway with the ease of a man entirely confident of his welcome. "I was hoping I might find you alone." "Were you?" she said, which was not quite a question. He entered anyway, settling into the chair across from her with the comfortable familiarity of long acquaintance. He was handsome in the way of men who had always known it, and had incorporated it so thoroughly into their manner that it had ceased to be a feature and become simply a characteristic. He studied her with a warmth that had an undertow. "How are you managing, truly?" he asked. "The fire must have been frightening." "Piran was frightened," she said. "I was practical. It seemed the more useful response." "You are always practical." He said it with something that resembled admiration. "It is one of the things I have always valued in you." A pause. "Among a great many others." She met his gaze steadily. "Calloway?" "I will be direct," he said, "because I believe you deserve directness, and because you are perceptive enough to have already understood what I am about to say." He leaned forward slightly. "I have been fond of you for some time. You know that. I have tried to respect your grief, the time you needed. I have not pressed." He held her gaze. "But I find I am struggling with the idea of stepping back any further." "I am engaged," she said carefully. Something shifted in his expression, not quite hurt, she thought, but the adjustment of a man revising a calculation. "Are you?" he said. "Sonara, I have known Emmerich Dawnford for 15 years. I know how he makes decisions, and the speed at which he makes them. What I witnessed in that entrance hall yesterday was a man producing words to close a difficult conversation, not a man in love." The observation landed with an accuracy she did not welcome. "What you are suggesting," she said, keeping her voice level, "comes very close to slander." "I am suggesting nothing," Calloway said pleasantly. "I am simply telling you what I know of him, which includes something you may not know." He paused, as though making a decision. "Edmund's journey. The one to the Marlowe estate in January, 2 years ago." She kept her face still. "Edmund asked Dawnford to travel with him," Calloway said. "They had planned it for weeks. And then, at the last possible moment, Emmerich withdrew. An estate matter, he told Edmund. Something that had come up unexpectedly." He let the silence settle. Edmund made the journey alone. I have always thought it was something worth knowing. The fire crackled softly in the grate. Sonara stared at the unopened book in her hands. She had not known that. In 2 years, not once, she had not known that. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because you deserve to know who you are placing your trust in." Calloway rose unhurriedly. "Whatever you may think of my own feelings, I would far rather you were clear-sighted than comfortable and uninformed." He paused at the door. "That is all I wish to say." He left. The room was very still. Somewhere in the house above her, she could hear the careful movements of a household beginning to stir. Footsteps on the floor above, a door closing softly. But in the library, everything was quiet. 2 years of constructing a shape of Edmund's death she could live alongside. A road accident. Ice. January dark. She had built her grief around that shape, had structured her mourning and her long, patient reconstruction of a life around the fact of it. She had never known that there had been a decision before the road, that there had been a man who had been supposed to be there and was not, that the absence of one person might have altered everything that followed. She did not know what it meant. She was not entirely certain she was ready to know what it meant, whether it made things better or worse, whether it was a reason to understand Emmerich or to despise him, whether guilt and love could exist in the same person at the same time without one consuming the other. She had been angry at an absence for 2 years, and now she understood there had been a presence behind it all along, one she had not known to reckon with. What she knew, with the absolute clarity that arrives when something long obscured suddenly comes into focus, was that the conversation she had postponed this morning could not be postponed any further. She had run out of reasons that were not simply fear. She set the unread book on the shelf, squared her shoulders, and went to find him. She found Emmerich in the stables. She had not expected that. She had expected him in the study or the library, or one of the formal rooms that seemed designed around his particular kind of controlled authority. She had not expected him crouched in the hay beside her 5-year-old son, both of them studying something cupped in Piran's hands, with expressions of identical, utterly serious gravity. She stopped in the stable doorway and did not announce herself. "It's a beetle," Piran was explaining. "A significant one," Emmerich agreed. "Look at the markings across the casing. That coloring is not commonly seen." "Is it rare?" "Exceptionally." Piran considered this with visible satisfaction. "Like me?" he asked, with complete sincerity. A pause, briefer than she expected. "Yes," Emmerich said quietly, "exactly like you." Piran received this with the gravity it deserved, then spotted his mother in the doorway. "Mama, the Duke says I am rare, like a beetle." "Exceptionally rare," Emmerich confirmed, rising. He rose, and the ease left his expression when he saw hers. He read the shape of what was coming, with the quiet accuracy of a man who had been paying attention. "Good morning." "Good morning," she said. "Piran, Mrs. Fenwick has your breakfast. But the beetle, we will return it to the garden together," Emmerich said to Piran, with complete seriousness. "After breakfast." Piran looked between the two of them with the shrewd perception of a child who had learned to read adult intention, accepted his fate with a sigh of considerable inconvenience, placed the beetle with great care in Emmerich's palm, and made his way toward the stable door with the bearing of a person deeply wronged by porridge. Emmerich set the beetle on the stable wall. It sat there for a dignified moment, then disappeared into a crack in the stone. He met Sonara's gaze, and she could see that he had already begun to read the shape of what was coming. "You spoke with Calloway this morning," he said. "In the library. He told you about Edmund's journey." "Not a question." She held his gaze. "Were you going to tell me yourself?" "Yes." No hesitation. "I have been trying to find the right way to say it for 2 years." "There is no right way," she said. "There is only the truth. which you have had 2 years to offer me, and have not." "I know." He said it without deflection, without the careful management she had come to expect from him. Just the 2 words, plain and without armor. "Why did you withdraw?" She kept her voice even, but she could hear something beneath the evenness that she did not want him to hear. "Why did you tell Edmund you could not travel with him?" He was quiet. The horses shifted in their stalls. Somewhere beyond the door, Pyron could be heard conducting a spirited negotiation with Mrs. Fenwick on the relative urgency of beetles versus breakfast. "Because I was a coward," Emmerich said finally. "Not in the way Calloway will have implied. Not from negligence, not from indifference, not from anything to do with Edmund himself." He held her gaze steadily. "I withdrew because spending a week in close company with Edmund and his wife had become something I could no longer do without it costing me more than I was able to absorb." The stable was very quiet. "His wife," she said slowly. "You." The word was quiet and entirely unambiguous. "Because of you." She did not speak, could not quite locate speech. "I had been managing it for years," he said, his voice careful, and even in the manner of a man reciting something he has rehearsed badly. "Managing what I felt, keeping the appropriate distance, doing everything correctly. But that particular January, I was managing it considerably less well than usual, and I knew that a week in close quarters would make it worse. So I found a reason to stay behind." His jaw worked. "And Edmund went alone. And I have not had a single day since that did not carry that knowledge." Sonara sat down on a hay bale. Her legs had arrived at a decision independent of the rest of her. "You loved me," she said. The words came out neither as accusation nor as question, simply as the naming of something that had just changed shape entirely. "I was not supposed to," he said. "He was my closest friend. You were his wife. I did not choose it. I did not encourage it. I did not act on it. But yes." "Does," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long, careful moment. "That is not a conversation I can have yet." "Why not?" "Because I am standing in a stable having told you the one thing I have spent 2 years avoiding, and I believe that is sufficient honesty for a single morning." Something cracked in her chest, quiet and involuntary. She had spent 2 years holding herself in perfect stillness, maintaining everything with great care and considerable effort, and she was exhausted by it. And here was this man, who had apparently been equally exhausted by the same work for considerably longer, and she did not know what to do with that knowledge except feel it pressing against the inside of her ribs, like something that had always been there and had only now been named. The weight of it was considerable. The relief of it, unexpected, was greater. "Emmerich," she said. He met her gaze. His eyes were raw in a way she had genuinely never seen them, like something that had been kept under glass for a long time and had been given air too suddenly. "Not yet," he said quietly. "Please." She wanted to push past it. The words "not yet" implied a "yet" waiting at the end of them, a conversation she was not certain she was prepared for. She stood in the hay-scented quiet of the stable and understood that this man had been carrying something on her behalf for 2 years and had never once put it down. "Piran will want you to come back for the beetle," she said instead. Something shifted in his face, fractional and unguarded. "I know." "He's going to tell everyone at Varenhollow about it," she said. "I want you to understand that. Every person Casimir knows will hear about this beetle." The faintest thing crossed Emmerich's face, not quite a smile, something approaching it with considerable caution. "He is," he said, "remarkably like Edmund." "He is nothing like Edmund," she said. "He is entirely and completely himself." A pause. Then it happened. A smile, small and reluctant, and wholly real, crossed Emmerich Donford's face for the first time since she had arrived at his house, and it was so unexpected and so unguarded that it did something to the interior of her chest that she was wholly unprepared for. "Yes," he said softly, "I am beginning to see that." She stood, smoothed her skirt, and drew her self-possession back around her with the efficiency of long practice. "We should go in," she said. "We should." He did not move immediately. "Sonara." She stopped. "I am sorry. For all of it. For the 2 years of silence. For not being on that road." The words reached somewhere she had not known to protect. "I know," she said, and walked out of the stable into the morning light before he could see what had happened to her face. Dinner that evening was a performance for which Sonara was considerably less prepared than the night before. Lady Renwick had spent the day consolidating her observations into a series of well-placed questions, and Calloway had spent it being attentive in a manner clearly designed to be noticed. He held doors and poured wine, and directed conversation toward Sonara with the patient consistency of a man demonstrating his availability to a room he suspected was being quietly evaluated. Emmerich said very little through most of the meal. He ate, he responded when addressed, and he watched Calloway with a quality of stillness that Sonara was beginning to recognize as the stillness of a man cataloging something he found deeply objectionable. "You must tell us," Lady Renwick said during a lull, addressing Sonara with an expression of warm and transparent calculation, "how you manage so capably. A widow alone, a young child, an establishment to run. It must be such a considerable weight." "I find it altogether manageable," Sonara said pleasantly. "But surely you feel the lack of steadiness, the practical burden of it." Lady Renwick paused with the precision of someone who knew exactly which word she was choosing not to say. "A woman in your circumstances requires a reliable foundation." "My circumstances," Sonara said, "are more stable than you may be imagining." "Of course they are," Calloway said from across the table, with a warmth that convinced no one. "Mrs. Aldwyn has always been remarkably self-possessed. It is one of her most exceptional qualities." He regarded her with the full weight of his attention. "Among a great many others?" Emmerich set his glass down. It was a small gesture, barely audible. But Sonara was sitting close enough to register the precise and deliberate quality of it, and she glanced at him. His manner was smooth and correct. His eyes were doing something different entirely. "My fiancée," he said, in a tone of such measured pleasantness that the edge beneath it was nearly invisible, "has never required her qualities catalogued for an audience. She is perfectly aware of what they are." He met Calloway's gaze directly. "As am I." Calloway held the look for a moment. "Naturally," he said equably. "I intended it only as a compliment." "I am entirely sure you did," Emmerich said, and returned to his plate. Sonara studied her food. She was fully aware of Lady Renwick absorbing this exchange with the focused attention of a woman who had been waiting for precisely this kind of intelligence. She understood she ought to feel irritated at Emmerich for drawing attention to the fault lines in their fiction. She could not. She could not quite manage the irritation. Something else was occupying the space where it should have been. After dinner, in the quiet interval before the household retired, she stood at the drawing-room window, looking out at the dark garden, and Emmerich appeared at her shoulder with 2 glasses of wine and the bearing of a man who had arrived at a decision. "That was unnecessary," she said quietly, accepting the glass. "Which part specifically?" "Defending me from a compliment." "He was not paying you a compliment," Emmerich said. "He was establishing familiarity with you in front of his mother, who was measuring the distance between you and this engagement to determine whether there was a viable opening." He looked out at the dark. "I grew up watching that technique deployed on behalf of my sisters. I know what it looks like." She was quiet a moment. "You see a great deal." I see what is directly in front of me, he said. It is the things at a distance I have historically managed considerably less well. The way he said it made her look at him. This morning, she said. You said not yet. He went very still. I'm not asking for the rest of it tonight, she said carefully. I'm simply telling you that I heard those words, that I understand there is a rest of it. A pause. I think I have been pretending not to understand that for longer than I should have. He turned to look at her. In the lamplight, his eyes were darker than usual and full of something he was working hard to contain. Sonara, he said. You do not need to say anything, she said. I am only stating what is true. You are not an obligation to me. She studied her glass. You have not been simply an obligation to me for considerably longer than I have been willing to examine. The silence between them shifted. It had weight and direction now, and a warmth that leaned toward something neither of them was quite ready to name. That, he said at last, his voice low and carefully held level, is an exceptionally difficult thing to hear. I imagine it is, she said, because it makes it very hard to do what I know I should be doing. He looked at her directly. Which is, maintain a sensible distance, protect your reputation, and remind myself that this situation is temporary. He paused. And remind myself that my father has spent 2 years pressing a courtship with the Thornhill family, a match with Lady Beatrice Thornhill that I have never refused because I was too much of a coward to explain why I could not want it. She absorbed this. And now? And now, he said softly, I find I am far less interested in being a coward. She held his gaze without speaking. Something in her chest had gone very still, very attentive. I'm afraid, he said very quietly, of what beginning would cost you. That, she said equally quietly, is the first entirely honest thing you have said to me since I arrived. He looked at her for one moment longer. Then he turned back toward the dark garden, and she could see the deliberate effort it required him to reassemble his usual careful order, and she recognized that effort with the intimate recognition of someone who had been making the same one for years and had never once found it entirely free. Good night, Sonara, he said. Good night. She walked upstairs with her wine glass, her expression composed, and her interior anything but, carrying the quiet and somewhat alarming knowledge that whatever she had kept locked and unnamed for 2 years was significantly less contained than she had believed. 3 days was a very short time, and in certain critical respects, she thought, climbing the last step in the dark, it was also a very long one. She woke to silence of the wrong kind. Every mother learns the difference. There is the silence of a sleeping house, deep and even and threaded through with the small sounds of breathing and settling timber, and there is the silence of a room that should contain a child and does not. Sonara was out of bed and in the adjoining room before she had fully assembled a coherent thought, and she stood in the doorway, looking at Piran's empty bed for exactly 3 seconds before she moved. The corridor was dark. The house was still. She went quickly and quietly in the direction of the stairs, trying to construct a rational explanation and finding that her chest was not particularly interested in rational explanations. She nearly walked directly into Emmerich at the top of the staircase. He was already dressed, or had never undressed, holding a lamp, and the look on his face told her immediately that he had also woken to the wrong kind of silence. His room is empty, she said. I know. I checked on my way past. He was already moving. The stables. She followed him without questioning it, down the back stairs and across the cold kitchen passage, and out through the side door into the dark, and the cold hit her like something solid, and she did not care about any of it. The stable yard was quiet. Emmerich pushed the stable door open and held the lamp up. Pyron was in the third stall. He had climbed up into the hay alongside the old gray mare the groom had introduced to him as Maisie, and he was curled against her flank with his hands tucked under his chin and his breathing slow and entirely contented. The mare had curved her neck around him in a posture of complete and maternal accommodation. He was perfectly warm. He was perfectly fine. He was, from every possible angle, completely all right. Senara put her hand on the stall door and could not speak for a moment. Emmerich stood beside her. Neither of them said anything. Pyron slept on with the absolute conviction of a child who had made a perfectly sensible decision and could not imagine why anyone might disagree. The mare blinked at them with enormous liquid eyes. "He told the groom he wanted to sleep near the horses," Emmerich said very softly. "I should have arranged it properly. I should have known he meant it literally." "He told me the same thing at the cottage," she said. Her voice came out unsteady in a way she had not intended. "He has been asking since we arrived. I told him perhaps tomorrow, every single day." "We should have listened to him," Emmerich said, and she understood he was not really talking about Piran's whereabouts. He was talking about the lamp in his hand, about already being awake and checking and moving toward the one place where a small boy would choose to sleep, about having watched over both of them without saying so and without asking anything in return, as though it were simply what a person did when they loved someone, without ceremony and without expectation. The relief was too large. She had been keeping it compressed since the moment she saw the empty bed, and here, in the lamplight, with Piran sleeping undisturbed and warm, she could not maintain the compression any longer. "I cannot do this alone indefinitely," she said. She had not planned to say it. The words arrived without permission, raw and unmanaged, and wholly honest. "I have been doing it alone for 2 years, and I'm very good at it, and I'm so tired of being good at it." Emmerich set the lamp on the stall post. "Senara," he said. "I know," she said quickly. "I know. I did not mean to say that. Forget I said it." "I will not," he said. She looked at him. The lamplight caught the line of his jaw, the shadows under his eyes that told of a man who had not been sleeping well, and she thought about the stable that morning, and January roads, and 2 years of stillness, shaped by something neither of them had been permitted to name, and she was so tired of the quiet between them. "I do not know how to do this anymore," she said. The words broke open as she said them, honest and frightened and stripped of the self-possession she had maintained so painstakingly for so long. "I do not know how to keep being so careful. I do not know how to be near you and feel what I feel and keep it organized and managed and set at an appropriate distance. I have been doing it since before Edmund died, and I am exhausted by it. I am exhausted." She heard his breath change. "I know," he said. His voice was low, rough with something kept under great pressure. "I know what that exhaustion feels like. I have been carrying the same weight, from the same cause, for longer than you have. And I am done pretending that constitutes strength." He reached for her hand. Not as performance, not for an audience, simply and directly, the way a man reaches for something he has been refusing to reach for a very long time. His fingers closed around hers with a steadiness that felt like the first solid ground she had stood on in months, and she looked at their joined hands in the lamplight and understood that something had just ended and something else had just begun. And there was no undoing either. She turned to face him, and whatever she had been about to say dissolved when she saw his face, which had abandoned its careful order entirely and was simply, finally, honest. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It was not careful. It was the kiss of a man who had kept a door locked for 2 years and had finally, in a cold stable in the middle of the night, with a sleeping child 10 feet away, let it open. She kissed him back with equal conviction, her free hand finding the front of his coat, and for one long, suspended moment, neither of them was managing anything at all. "Forgive me," said a voice from the stable doorway. They stepped apart. Lady Renwick stood in the entrance, lamp in hand, her bearing assembled into something studiously neutral that communicated with perfect efficiency that it would not remain neutral for long. She took in the scene, Pyrrhon in the hay, the two of them standing 3 inches apart with the residue of something unmistakable still evident in both their faces, and said only, "I heard movement. I came to ensure there was no problem." "Everything is perfectly well," Emmerich said, his voice absolutely steady. "Pyrrhon had decided to spend the night with the horses. We have found him safe." "I see that," Lady Renwick said, a pause containing far more than she chose to say. "I'm glad everyone is safe. Good night." She walked back across the yard without another word. Sonara watched her go. The yard was very quiet. Pyrrhon breathed on in the hay, undisturbed and entirely contented. Then she looked at Emmerich. 3 days, she said. 2 now, he said. And his face held everything he had not yet said, everything waiting at the end of not yet. And she understood that whatever the next 2 days brought, they would not be the same as the days before. She should have known it would not last until morning. She had known it would not last until morning. She had known it in the stable, some part of her that operated below hope and above resignation, reading Emmerich Donford with the clarity that proximity eventually bestows. She had known, and she had kissed him anyway, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had done in 2 years. By the time she came downstairs the following morning, he had rebuilt every wall. He was at the breakfast table, controlled and correct, and formally dressed at an hour that suggested he had either woken very early or not slept at all. He rose when she entered, addressed her as Mrs. Aldwyn, poured her tea with the attentive precision of a host, and inquired after Pyrrhon with a warmth that was perfectly measured and felt like a room that had been very recently rearranged to hide what it had held before. She sat down. She accepted the tea. She looked at him. He met her gaze with a face so comprehensively managed, it was itself a kind of confession. "You are doing it again," she said quietly, so that Mrs. Fenwick, moving at the sideboard, could not hear. "I'm having breakfast," he said. "You are retreating," she said. "I watched you do it 2 years ago. I am watching you do it now." A muscle moved in his jaw. He said nothing. "Emmerich, the Renwicks will be down shortly," he said, his voice even. "I would rather not give them anything additional to observe." "Is that what this is?" she said. "Caution." "It is sense," he said. He met her gaze once, directly, and the effort it cost him was visible for just a moment before the self-possession settled back. "What happened last night was," he stopped. "Do not say it was a mistake," she said. "It was not a mistake," he said. "But it cannot be the foundation for anything. Not here. Not yet. Not with his mother watching your every move, and Calloway measuring every moment I spend at your side." He set down his cup. "I am not retreating. I am being careful." She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable, then turned to her breakfast. She did not believe him. She believed he believed it, which was a different thing entirely. 2 hours later, she passed the study with a letter in her hand, intended for the post, and the door was slightly ajar, and she heard his voice before she could make the decision not to listen. Calloway was with him. She could not see either of them, only hear, and she told herself she should walk on and did not walk on. "What happened between you and Mrs. Aldwyn last night?" Calloway's voice. Not quite a question. "Nothing that concerns you." Emmerich's. "Lady Renwick is not discreet," Calloway said. "Whatever she saw, will be in 3 letters by tomorrow morning, delivered to 3 different drawing rooms in London. A beat of quiet. Then it will be in 3 letters, Emmerich said. Is that wisdom? Calloway said. She is a widow, with a young child, and a modest income, and absolutely no protection from what those letters could do to her. You know that. You are a man with a title and an estate, and a family whose disapproval will inconvenience you considerably, but will not destroy you. She does not have your insulation. She will bear the full weight of it, and there is nothing she can do to stop it. Another silence, longer. I'm aware of what she has and doesn't have, Emmerich said quietly. His voice had changed. The steadiness in it sounded different, like something being held too tight. I am aware of every specific way in which what I feel for her is a liability to her, rather than an advantage. I do not require you to list them. Then perhaps, Calloway said, you should ask yourself whether the kindest thing you can do for her is step back. The longest pause yet. Perhaps, Emmerich said. The word was quiet and terrible. Perhaps you are right. Sonara walked away from the door. She went upstairs with the letter still in her hand and sat on the edge of her bed for a long moment. Then she went to Mrs. Fenwick. I need the trunk brought down, she said. We are leaving this afternoon. Mrs. Fenwick opened her mouth and closed it. Yes, ma'am, she said. Sonara went to find Piran, who was in the garden bidding an emotional farewell to several beetles, and told him they would be going to stay with the Whitfield family, who had extended an open invitation, and that he should say his goodbyes to Maisie because they were leaving after luncheon. Piran looked up at her with his father's dark eyes and said very clearly, Is it because of the Duke? It is because it is time, she said. He makes you smile, Piran said, with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to be tactful about true things. You smiled at him in the stable last night. I watched from the hay. I was not all the way asleep. He paused, studying her with those serious eyes. You never smile like that at anyone else, Mama. Not like you mean it. Not a real one. He paused, studying her with those serious eyes. I want you to have real ones. She looked at her son for a long beat. At the solemn certainty in his face, so much older than 5 had any right to be. Then she looked at the house, at the long gray stone of it against the winter sky, and found that she could not speak. Come along, she said at last, and took his hand. Come and say goodbye to Maisie. 2 things arrived at Caldonmere Hall within the same hour that afternoon. The first was a rider from London, bearing a letter sealed with the Dawnford family crest. Emmerich's father. The letter was, from what Emmerich later described with the economy of a man who had received worse and was determined not to show it, thorough in its disapproval and precise in its expectations. The elder Duke of Caldonmere had received intelligence, presumably from the Renwicks, or someone adjacent to them, regarding the widow residing at his son's estate. He had also received word of what he described as the unconscionable withdrawal from the Thornhill courtship, a match Emmerich had allowed his father to cultivate for 2 years, and which had now been set aside without consultation or adequate explanation. The letter made clear that Emmerich was expected in London within the fortnight to discuss his obligations. It made equally clear that continued association with a woman of no title and modest circumstance would be viewed as a decision with consequences the family would not be obligated to absorb on his behalf. The second thing to arrive was Casimir. He came in hard from the road, handed his horse to the stable boy, and walked through the entrance hall with the bearing of a man who had received a letter of his own and found its contents entirely unacceptable. He found Sonara on the stairs with her traveling cloak already on. You are leaving, he said. Yes. Without sending word to me. You were traveling. I did not want to inconvenience you. Sonara. He said her name the way he had said it since they were children, the one syllable containing an entire argument. He looked at her, at the trunk being carried down behind her, at Piran on the bottom step with his coat buttoned and his small jaw set in an expression of stoic acceptance that was far too adult for 5 years old, and at the particular quality of Sonara's stillness that he had learned to read as the stillness of someone who has already decided something and is bracing for the cost of it. Then Casimir looked past her and found Emmerich at the top of the stairs, standing very still. "We need to speak," Casimir said. "Yes," Emmerich said. "We do." "All three of us," Casimir said. His tone left no space for negotiation or delay. He turned to Sonara. "Leave the trunk where it is for the moment." She wanted to argue. She looked at her brother's face and recognized the expression that had no interest in being argued with. "Mrs. Fenwick," she said, without turning, "could you take Piran to the kitchen, please?" "Can I have cake?" Piran said, assessing the room with the accuracy of a child who understood that adult distraction was generally favorable to his culinary interests. "Yes," said Casimir, Sonara, and Emmerich simultaneously. And there was a moment in which all three of them recognized what they had just done and said nothing about it. Casimir waited until Mrs. Sardin, Fenwick, and Piran had disappeared toward the kitchen before he turned fully to Emmerich. "Calloway Renwick wrote to me," he said. "I have the letter in my coat. He implies that my sister was placed in a compromising situation at your invitation, that the engagement you declared to the Renwicks was a transparent fiction, and that her reputation has been materially damaged by her time in your household. He suggests that if someone does not act to address the situation, he will feel obligated to make his concerns more widely known." Emmerich said nothing. "It is a threat," Casimir said, "dressed as concern." "Yes," Emmerich said. "And your father's letter?" Casimir held his gaze steadily. "I passed his rider on the road. I assume the contents are similarly encouraging." Emmerich held Casimir's gaze, then looked down at Sonara. She was still on the stairs, halfway between goings and staying, her traveling cloak absurd against the warm interior of the house, her face composed in the way he recognized as the face she wore when something had hurt her and she had decided not to show it. "It does not matter," Emmerich said. He said it without drama, the way a man says something when he has already passed the point of negotiating it with himself. "My father's letter does not matter." "That," said Casimir, in the tone of a man choosing his next words with great care, "is an interesting position for a man of your obligations to take." "It is the only position I have left," Emmerich said. He came down the stairs and stopped on the bottom step, level with Sonara, close enough to speak without raising his voice. "I heard you this morning. I heard Calloway ask me whether stepping back was the kindest thing I could do for you, and I heard myself say perhaps he was right." He held her gaze. "I have been telling myself that story for years, that staying away was courtesy, that keeping my distance was generosity, that the most honorable thing I could do was want you in silence and make certain you never had to know it." His voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him. "It is not generosity. It is cowardice, and I am done with it." Casimir had gone very still. Sonara looked at Emmerich. At the openness of his countenance, the absence of the controlled self-possession she had come to read as a kind of permanent armor, he looked frightened and certain in equal measure, and she had not seen that combination in a human face before, and understood it as completely as she understood it now. "Calloway's letter," Emmerich said, turning to Casimir, "is a threat from a man whose family is significantly in debt and who spent the last 4 days determining whether he could position himself as a candidate for your sister's hand. I have documentation of the debt. I can make the motivation clear to anyone he might otherwise persuade. He paused. As for my father's letter, I intend to respond to it directly and honestly, which will be uncomfortable for both of us, and which I have avoided for far too long. It is past time. He looked back at Sonara. Do not leave, he said. Not yet. Give me an hour. He said it without drama, the way a man states what he knows to be true. He dealt with Calloway first. He found him in the drawing room in conversation with Lady Renwick and a servant who had been asked to see about a carriage. He entered without urgency and said, in the tone of a man making a private thing public because he had decided it was necessary, "Renwick, a word." Calloway looked at him with the look of a man rapidly assessing how much authority was in the room. It outweighed his own, and he knew it. He excused himself from his mother, who watched him go with the sharp attention of a woman accustomed to reading her son's calculations. They stood in the corridor outside the drawing room, and Emmerich spoke quietly and without ambiguity for approximately 4 minutes. He named the debt. He named the letters. He named the pattern of behavior that had characterized 4 days at a country house, constituting, in the most charitable interpretation possible, an organized attempt to use a widow's vulnerability as a financial instrument. You saw an opportunity, Emmerich said without heat. Your family's finances have been deteriorating for several years. Everyone with business interests in the county is aware of it. A match with Sonara Aldwin's family would have addressed a considerable portion of your father's liabilities. When you found her here, apparently unprotected, you moved toward her the way a man moves toward a solution. I understand the logic. I find it contemptible. Calloway's color shifted. You have no proof of intent, he said. I have your letter to Casimir, Emmerich said. I have Lady Renwick's account of the stable yard, which she will provide to anyone who asks, because she has never in her life suppressed a useful piece of information. I have Sonara's account of every private conversation you sought with her during this visit, including the one in which you told her she looked trapped and offered to assist her in escaping an arrangement you were already suggesting was fictitious. He held Calloway's gaze without blinking. I have enough to make the picture entirely clear to anyone I choose to clarify it for. I am not going to do that, provided you withdraw the implications in your letter to Casimir in writing, and provided you leave Sonara Aldwin completely and permanently alone. And if I choose otherwise, then I will, with regret, but without any hesitation at all, do precisely what I have described. Emmerich's voice was entirely even. And I will ensure that the families most relevant to your own matrimonial prospects are among the first to hear it. I have connections in that area that you do not. Calloway held his ground for a beat longer, the way a man does when he knows the position is lost, but has not quite found a way to leave it without dignity. You are throwing away a great deal, he said. An alliance, your father's approval, your family's standing. For a widow with no title, and a young child, and a modest income, who will be the subject of talk for years. I'm aware of exactly what I'm doing, Emmerich said. There was no anger in his voice and no defensiveness, only the particular clarity of a man who has made a decision and is no longer afraid of it. She is worth it, every part of it. Now make your decision, Renwick, and write the letter. Calloway looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, something that was not quite anger and not quite respect, that acknowledged, reluctantly, that the man standing opposite him wasn't going to be moved, and had always, from the beginning, been the stronger one in the room. He wrote the letter. He left Caldenmere Hall within the hour, his mother silent and glacial beside him in the carriage, the letter of withdrawal drafted and handed to Casimir before the carriage pulled away. Casimir received it with the air of a man filing something he intended to keep indefinitely. Then Emmerich sat down, and wrote to his father. He had been composing this letter in his mind, in fragments and half-sentences, for approximately 3 years. He had imagined writing it a dozen times, and always found a reason to set it aside. There was always a more appropriate moment, a better arrangement of words, a more diplomatic approach that would achieve the same end with less damage to the relationship. He had told himself this so many times that he had nearly convinced himself it was strategic patience rather than simple fear. He sat at the study desk with Casimir across from him, which he had asked for because he had learned several things about himself in the past 4 days, one of them being that accountability required witnesses. He wrote for 40 minutes, and when he had finished, he handed the letter to Casimir without folding it. Casimir read it in silence. It was a long letter. It was honest in a way that Emmerich's letters to his father had never been. It named what he felt. It named what he intended. It acknowledged the cost to the family's plans and offered neither apology nor retraction for what those plans had failed to account for, which was that a man's heart has a way of making its own decisions regardless of what is arranged around it. It closed with the simple and irrevocable statement that his son had made his choice, that the choice was Senara Aldwin, and that the Duke could respond as he saw fit, but the decision would not be revisited. Casimir folded the letter slowly and placed it on the desk between them. "You understand," he said, "that your father may respond in ways that are very uncomfortable for a very long time." "Yes," Emmerich said, "and that society will have a great deal to say." "Yes." "And that Senara will absorb a portion of whatever is said, regardless of what you do to shield her." Emmerich held his gaze steadily. "I know. I intend to make certain that what she absorbs is significantly less than what she would face if I were not beside her for every moment of it. But I cannot make her choices for her. I can only make mine, and let her make hers. Which is why I need you to go to her." Casimir was quiet for a moment, studying the man who had been his closest friend for 15 years, and who was now asking permission to become something rather more significant than that. Then he rose without ceremony. "I know," Casimir said, and left the room. Senara was in the small sitting room she had claimed on the first day. The traveling cloak was still on. She had not removed it, which told Casimir something he absorbed without comment as he settled into the chair that had been Emmerich's preferred seat for 3 days, which told him something further. He looked at his sister. She looked back at him, and he recognized in her face the expression he had known since they were children, the one she wore when she was genuinely frightened and was managing it with everything she had. "Tell me honestly," he said. "Not what you think you should feel. Not what would be most convenient or appropriate. What do you actually feel?" "I do not know," she said. "Yes, you do." She said nothing. Outside, the winter light was failing, and the room had grown dim. She had not lit the lamp, which he understood as a small act of privacy in a house where she had felt observed for several days. "I feel terrified," she said at last, "of Emmerich, of what choosing him means." She looked at her hands. "I have been composed for 2 years, Casimir. I have managed everything. I have not cried in front of Piran. I have not allowed myself to want anything that was not practical and achievable and safe. I have been very good at it." She paused. "And then he told me he withdrew from Edmund's journey because of what he felt for me. And I sat in a stable in the dark and told him I was exhausted, and he held my hand, and I don't know how to go back to being composed after that." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "I'm afraid of hoping for something and being wrong about it. I have built everything I am, since Edmund died, around not needing anyone, around being sufficient, around proving that I could manage alone and manage well." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. And now he looks at me as though I am worth looking at. He held my hand in a cold stable at midnight and asked nothing in return. And I cannot tell whether what I feel is real or whether it is simply what happens when a person has been alone long enough and someone kind is nearby. I cannot trust myself to know the difference, and I do not know if that uncertainty is a reason to stay or a reason to go. Casimir looked at his sister for a long moment. When Edmund died, he said quietly, "You held everyone else together. You held Piran together. You held the household together. You held yourself together with a precision that frightened me, if I am honest with you. I watched you manage everything flawlessly, and I was proud of you and worried about you in equal measure, because there is a kind of strength that looks after everyone except itself. I watched you put yourself last for 2 years and call it duty, and I let you, because I did not know how to tell you that you were allowed to want something without feeling as though you were betraying Edmund by wanting it." She looked at him with wet eyes. "You are not betraying him," Casimir said quietly. "Edmund loved you. He would not have wanted this for you. He would not have wanted you to be so careful and so alone. You know that." "I know it," she said. "Knowing it and believing it are not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "They rarely are." He leaned forward. "You are not asking me for permission," he said. "You are asking me to tell you that your uncertainty is normal, that fearing hope after loss is not weakness." He held her gaze. "Senara, the fact that you cannot be certain what you feel is your answer. The things that cost us nothing are never the things that matter. It is only the things worth having that terrify us." She was very still. "Is it truly that simple?" she said softly. "It is never simple," Casimir said. "But he wrote a letter to his father 40 minutes ago that will produce consequences he cannot fully predict, and he wrote it in front of me as a witness because he did not trust himself not to revise it alone in the night when his nerve failed him." He paused. "He is frightened too. He's choosing anyway. That is what courage looks like, not the absence of fear." He held her gaze. "What do you choose?" The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the garden, and the last gray light was almost gone. She looked at her brother with the gray eyes she had inherited from their mother, and he saw in them the moment when the self-possession stopped being a performance and became something else, something real and unguarded and wholly her own. "I choose him," she said softly. Casimir nodded once. He rose without ceremony. "Then I will give him my permission to court you, on the conditions that he does it properly and publicly, that he does not flinch from what it costs in front of you, and that if he ever gives me cause to regret this conversation, I will consider our friendship of secondary importance to my obligation as your brother." "He will not give you cause," she said. "No," Casimir agreed. "I do not believe he will." He went to find Emmerich. She sat alone in the dim room for a moment longer, listening to the quiet of the house around her. The faint sound of Piran's voice from the kitchen below, still negotiating with complete confidence. The distant movement of footsteps in the corridor, the particular quality of stillness that a house has when it is full of people you trust. Then, quietly and without ceremony, she removed the traveling cloak. She folded it over the arm of the chair and left it there. She went down to the kitchen and found Piran at the table with Mrs. Fenwick and the remains of a very considerable quantity of cake. She sat beside him and put her arm around his small shoulders and held him close. "Are we staying?" he asked, with his mouth full. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, with complete satisfaction. "I told Maisie we were staying. She will be pleased." He considered this for a moment, then looked up at her with those dark, earnest eyes. "Can the Duke come and see the beetle again tomorrow?" Sonara looked at her son, at the brightness in his face, the easy and uncomplicated certainty of a child who simply assumed that the people he loved would be where they should be. She thought about a small boy sitting on a boot in a garden and naming a wound so plainly that it had been impossible to look away from it. "Yes," she said, "I believe he can." She smiled. Not the constructed smile, not the assembled and maintained one, the real one, the kind that arrived without announcement, the kind she meant. The scandal, when it reached London, was thorough. Within a fortnight of the Renwicks' return to the city, it was known in every drawing room of consequence that the Duke of Caldenmere's heir had spent several days in questionable circumstances with a widow at a country estate, and that he had subsequently set aside a long-anticipated match with a family of excellent standing to pursue the widow in question. The whispers were of various kinds, the kind that questioned Sonara's motives, the kind that questioned Emmerich's judgment, the kind that suggested, with the vague relish peculiar to people who enjoy other people's difficulties, that the entire business was likely to end badly for everyone involved. Emmerich appeared in London the following week, with Sonara on his arm at every social engagement she could be persuaded to attend, and proceeded to demonstrate with complete consistency that he was unbothered by any of it. He stood beside her when women whispered. He introduced her to people who had not yet decided what to think, and his manner made the decision for them. He faced anyone who spoke critically of her with such mild and genuine inquiry that most of them found something else to say. He was unfailingly, publicly, unapologetically present. His father's response had been, as Casimir had predicted, uncomfortable. There had been a meeting in London that Emmerich described afterward only as the most difficult conversation of his life. The alliance with the Thornhills was broken. Certain family interests would take years to repair. The elder Duke's opinion remained, for some time, emphatically clear. Emmerich absorbed all of it without complaint. He called on Sonara at the townhouse Casimir had opened for the season every day during approved hours, with chaperones and calling cards and every observance their world demanded, and he did it with the manner of a man who had simply decided that this was what he was going to do, and saw no reason to feel inconvenienced by any of it. He came one afternoon in early spring, and found Piran in the drawing room conducting a formal introduction between his mother and a series of small carved horses arranged along the windowsill. "This one," Piran said, holding up a small gray figure, "is Maisie, and this one is Duke. I named him after you," he added to Emmerich, "because he is the biggest." The room went very quiet. Sonara watched Emmerich's face. He studied the small carved horse with an expression she had never seen on him before, something open and young and wholly unguarded. And then he met Piran's gaze with the same expression and said, with complete seriousness, "That is a very significant honor." "I know," Piran said. "I only give them important names." Sonara watched Emmerich's face, and what she saw there was something she had been watching emerge for weeks in quiet increments. The look of a man who had spent his adult life inhabiting formal spaces with formal authority, learning slowly and with visible joy how to simply be present somewhere, how to let things reach him. He proposed 3 months after Casimir gave his permission. He did it in the drawing room at Varenhollow, with Casimir and her mother both present. Simply one knee on the carpet, and a ring that had been his grandmother's, and a sentence shorter than she had expected, and more honest than anything she had prepared herself for. "I have spent 3 years being afraid of you," he said. "I should like to spend the rest of my life being something else." She said yes before he had finished the sentence. The wedding was small by the standards of a ducal family. Casimir walked her down the aisle with the expression of a man at peace with a decision he had made carefully. Emmerich's mother sat in the front pew and wept with genuine happiness from the moment Sonara appeared in the doorway. The elder Duke did not attend. Piran sat in the second pew between Mrs. Fenwick and the young groom from the Caldenmere stables, and watched the ceremony with the earnest attention of a person who understood that something important was happening and intended to remember it thoroughly. When Emmerich put the ring on Sonara's finger, Piran said, quietly but not quietly enough, "Good," and Mrs. Fenwick covered her mouth, and the young groom studied the ceiling with great intensity, and Casimir made a sound he later maintained was a cough. Sonara looked at her husband, and her husband looked at her, and neither of them laughed, which was perhaps the greatest act of collective discipline the room had ever witnessed. 2 years later, Caldenmere Hall at Christmas. The house was warm in the way large houses become warm when they are full of people who belong in them. Fire in every grate and evergreen, along every mantelpiece, and laughter threading through the rooms. From the drawing room came voices, Casimir's family, and Emmerich's mother, and the young groom, now head stable hand, engaged in a spirited debate about whether Maisie should have been included in the Christmas Day procession. She should have been. Everyone knew it. The debate was not really about Maisie. Emmerich found Sonara at the window at the end of the long gallery, looking out at the garden. He stopped a few feet behind her and looked at what she was looking at. Piran was in the garden. He was 7 now, and he had grown, and he was chasing snowflakes falling in slow spirals from a white sky, turning in circles with his arms out and his face tilted up, entirely absorbed in the specific joy of being 7 years old in a garden in the snow. He had been out there for 20 minutes and showed no signs of coming in. He had named most of the snowflakes individually and was narrating their descent in a tone of considerable scientific authority. Emmerich looked at Sonara. She was watching her son, and she was smiling. Not the careful smile, not the assembled and maintained one that had occupied the surface of her face for 2 years before she came to Caldenmere Hall. The other one, the one that arrived without announcement and stayed without effort, the one that reached her eyes and changed the light in the room around her and made the gallery feel like somewhere entirely different from the cold, formal space it had been before she walked into it. She was smiling the way she meant it. He stood still and looked at her for one long moment, because he had been waiting to see this exact thing since the afternoon. A small boy sat on his boot and named a wound so plainly that it had been impossible to look away from it. And the sight of it now, the simple, undeniable reality of it, reached something in his chest that he had no word for and did not need one. He moved to stand beside her. She looked at him, still smiling, and he thought he had never in his life been so grateful for every inconvenient and impossible circumstance that had placed them both exactly here. "He has named the large one Geoffrey," she said. "The cluster near the gate are all called after horses." "Of course they are," Emmerich said. She leaned against him, very slightly, in the way she did now when no one was watching, easy and unguarded and natural. His hand found hers. Below in the garden, Piran spun one final time and looked up at the window. He saw them standing there together, both of them looking down at him, and his face split into the absolute, uncomplicated brightness of a child who has everything he needs within sight. He lifted both arms and waved with his entire body, vigorous and completely himself. Sonara lifted her free hand and waved back. Emmerich watched her face as she did it. The smile had not moved. If anything, it had deepened into something quieter and more permanent, the kind that had stopped being an event and become simply the way things were, the kind she meant. My mama never smiles. She was smiling now. Some storms, he thought, holding her hand in the warm quiet of the gallery, with the snow falling soft outside, and their son waving from the garden, and the rest of their life arranged before them like a country he was only beginning to know, were worth weathering entirely. Some choices were worth every cost, and some loves, the real ones, the hard-won ones, the ones that asked for courage before they offered anything in return, were worth choosing every day for the rest of your life. He already had. He always would.